Join us September 25th, 26th, and 27th for a 3-day special streaming event, Strange Realities, to push the limits of your reality. Featuring authors, academics, researchers, occultists, experiencers, podcasters, and practitioners. All presenting fresh cutting-edge material and research. Streaming live. Featuring presentations by
Brent Rains,
editor of Alternate Perceptions magazine.
Aaron Gullius,
Host of the Saucer Life podcast.
David Metcalf,
Writer and researcher.
Alan Greenfield,
Author of Secret Cipher of the Euphonauts.
Stephanie Quick,
Writer and blogger.
Red Pill Junkie,
14 researcher and explorer.
Tim Banal,
Host of Banal of America.
Guy Malone,
Iconoclast and troublemaker.
Timothy Ritter,
Host of Strange Familiars.
Kiki Dombrowski,
Author and practitioner.
Greg Bishop,
Author of Project Beta.
Jenny Ashford,
Host of 13 O'Clock.
Recluse,
Host of The Farm.
Jack Montgomery,
Folk Magic.
Joshua Cutchin,
Author of Thieves in the Night.
Reverend Michael Carter,
Alien Contact Experiencer.
Dr. Future,
Host of Future Quake.
Tony Kale,
Author of Memphis Hoodoo.
Rin Collier,
Occultist.
Soraya Askath,
Host of Where Did the Road Go? And John Tinney, Ghost Stalkers in Hell.
all 3 days, only $20. Tickets and info available at strangerealitiesconference.com. Brought to you by the Conspirinormal podcast. Conspirinormal.com. Strange Realities.
See, this is what I was like Steven, I was just like talking to Seraphiel earlier, right before we called you, and it's like, where'd they find these people? There was no background check. Because
it's probably the best they could do.
Like, they found the person that has some of the most ridiculous beliefs that they possibly could.
Well, I mean, it's not, though, because this is, affiliated with the Council for National Policy. I mean, there's always been a strong dominionist trend in it. I mean, I think Tom LaHaye or somebody like that, or Tim LaHaye was one of, the founders. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, it's not surprising to me that there would be these kind of religious kooks, because, I mean, they've always been sort of hovering in the background of the Council for National Policy. So
they're probably already in the network.
Yeah, essentially.
They're probably like, oh, well, she's a doctor.
Yeah, I mean, effectively, going through the register, I mean, who do we have who's actually a medical doctor? Okay, were you willing to come out and, parrot the party line on this COVID thing for us? Well, all right, great, you're hired.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Oh, my gosh. Well, okay, guys. Welcome back to Conspirinormal. And it's your host, your friendly host, Adam, and Seraphiel is here.
As reality gets stranger and stranger.
Yes, yeah. That's kind of a plug, I guess, for the Strange Realities Conference, I suppose.
Yeah.
But also the truth. But we have someone that's actually going to be presenting at our online Strange Realities Conference, and that is this man of mystery. We call him Recluse. Some call him Steven. Welcome to Conspirinormal again, Recluse.
Oh, thank you guys so much for having me back on again.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Absolutely. We've been listening to the podcast that you run now called The Farm, and have been really enjoying it. Some of the guests that you've had on, and I've really enjoyed the discussions. You guys really dig deep into a lot of, I guess, the conspiracy world and some of the things that are going on with these different political entities, and
really been exploring what you all call the right side of the pyramid in particular.
I mean, I'm glad you guys have been enjoying it, and, there is a lot of thought that goes into the gifts. I mean, certainly I'm really happy with a lot of the different perspectives that we've had coming through lately. Of course, the most recent podcast, we had Paul Weston up there to, talk about George Hunt Williamson and William Dudley Paley. And, I mean, I just think it's great because, I mean, Paul, is essentially a practicing occultist, a pagan, and what have you. And, I mean, it's fabulous to get him on there. And then probably in about 2 weeks, we're going to have Doc Future in there. I mean, as you guys know, is a very devout Christian, and he's also going to denounce William Dudley Paley. So that's fantastic. I mean, I'm all for anybody who's going to come on there to denounce that cretin.
Yeah. But he's kind of like he's somebody that you could denounce all across the board of any kind of like religious or political spectrum. I suppose. Well,
yeah.
know.
I mean, we can all join hands and denounce this guy. I mean, it's wonderful. I mean, it's it's a bridge of a kind that we're trying to build here.
Yeah. Well, I think one thing that we've never talked to you about, man, has been just like kind of how you got into all this kind of, I guess, the material that you talk about on this show. I mean, you're really someone that even before you started doing the farm that we found out about that really digs deep and really does some serious research. But how did this kind of start for you?
Who's the man behind the spider?
Yeah, right.
I mean, it probably really went back to my dad. My dad had probably been in military intelligence at some point. I know I've been kind of criticized for that a little bit before, because I said at one point he was in special forces. That's what I was always told by my mom, but I don't know if that was the case after going through his military record. But I feel pretty certain he was in Army intelligence, because he was stationed at Fort Meade, home at the NSA, and he also did some time at a very classified listening post in Greenland at one point. But my dad definitely had a very parapolitical / conspiratorial worldview. I mean, I believe it was William Cooper. I can remember listening to him probably back in the early 90s when I was only like probably 10 or so years old, thereabouts. Wow. So definitely, I can remember a lot of this stuff going over it with Dad years ago. And then I think a lot of it was probably rekindled bizarrely by a experience I had on mushrooms, actually, when I was at the University of Colorado at Colorado Springs. That's a really weird place to trip in general, because you're right in the heartland of like focus on the family and what have you.
Yeah.
So anyway,
the Air Force Academy.
Yeah, the Air Force, and then there's all the military stuff, NORAD, and everything is there and what have you. I mean, yeah, it's a creepy place in general. But so yeah, I'm at this college campus. I was living at the dorms at the time. I took the mushrooms. I think this actually might have been the first time I had really tripped too. And so I'm wandering around. I hadn't really gotten much in terms of visuals or anything. So the cafeteria was open late at night. I kind of was starting to get a little hungry, so I wandered into this thing. Of course, I'm in the heartland of Christian fundamentalism and what have you there, and boom, I suddenly think that I'm on a spaceship. I'm like walking into this cafeteria. It's all kind of like white with smoke and what have you everywhere. And I'm seeing all of these gray aliens walking around amongst the students and the staff and what have
you.
Yes. It was, to this day, it's probably the most intense hallucination I've ever had. It was just mind blowing. And that had gotten me interested in the whole, the notion of people seeing extraterrestrials while they were on psychedelics. Which had actually led me to some of Strassman's DMT research. And from there, I just kind of started getting into the whole history of research into hallucinogens. And that kind of brought up all the MK Ultra stuff and the parapsychology stuff and what have you. And that kind of rekindled a lot of my interest in these arcane topics. And from there, it kind of went through a period of very intense research for several years before I started blogging.
Well, I mean, like I said before, you dig pretty deep, Stephen, on a lot of this stuff. And we had you on the first time. We talked about the Knights of Malta, and that was actually where we kind of introduced you and Dr. Future, because he had done a lot of research on them. And then the second time was only just a couple of months ago when we had you on talking about the book, the Strange Tales of the Parapolitical. But I mean, you cover like stuff about digging really deep into Trump and his connections and Roy Cohn, all the way to like mysterious groups like La Cercle and these like kind of really like these paramilitary and stay behind armies like the Gladio. I mean, and you're even working on stuff like about Jeffrey Epstein. And so like you're covering a pretty good gamut of like a lot of like really dirty tricks and like a lot of like bad skullduggery.
Yeah, well, I mean, the weird thing is, I mean, it's all, interrelated, honestly. I mean, that was, almost one of the reasons why I just eventually branched out into just so many crazy topics, because I mean, in order to understand certain things, you've got to research other topics, and that leads to other topics, and after a while it's just like, well, I'm researching these weird Christian fundamentalist cults, and I'm finding out that they're into orgone energy and Scientology, and it's like, wow, how does this even happen?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
What I think what separates a lot of your work too is that you have so much historical context, and you're able to look at the meta levels of how conspiracy theory narratives are created and used by certain groups at the same time. So that it's like a breath of fresh air, and it makes sense that you have memories of this kind of conspiracy culture as early as you do, because you're able to kind of put it in more perspective.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's definitely really fascinating. I mean, the more I've gotten into this, you know, I really kind of started to realize that the conspiracy culture itself, in many ways, is every bit as interesting as a lot of the subjects that it is exploring.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
Yes. Yes.
And I mean-
also how it's been weaponized too.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's absolutely something too. I'm going to get into my presentation a bit at the Strange Realities,
Good.
you know, my spot there, and then also I've got another extended essay that's I'm just still kind of tinkering on a little bit. That's also sort of the launching point for the chat I'm going to give at the con. But yeah, it's going to be really cool. It's going to get into psychological warfare, and specifically how a lot of occultism and what have you was used deliberately by psychological warfare officers, and specifically those of a very right-leaning perspective, probably to rally the Christian right during the 1980s. So I think it's going to be a very fascinating topic. I'm just really excited about some of this research coming out. It's going to be really cool.
Nice.
That origin story is really interesting, with your psychedelic experience really being this catalyst, because there's so much of a history of that, just the things that psychedelic experience have in common with a lot of this type of thinking, as far as like this associative, paranoid, almost schizophrenic way of thinking that, you know, definitely relates to people like Robert Anton Wilson and other psychedelic pioneers.
Yeah, I mean, I could definitely see that, and I mean, I think that sort of goes in a lot to like my research, and I mean, I know I get asked a question a lot, essentially, about how I make a lot of these connections and what have you. I've actually got a guy, what was it, the Irish Socialist Republican or something, who wanted me to do a chat basically with him on that, and it's a really odd process, because I do read like a phenomenal amount of books, and a lot of times to make the connections, it is actually a process of disassociation. A lot of times I like to lay around in a dark room with some headphones on, listening to some really atmospheric music, and just try to totally cut off the outside world, just kind of loosen my mind up, and from there I just kind of will start running names through my head, and certain things will start to connect, and really that's how I do make a lot of these connections. It's very strange. I mean, that's why I almost kind of think of a lot of my research, even though I've always kind of viewed myself as more of a historian, I do sort of feel like a lot of my research and my writing and what have you is approached more like a novel. It does feel very much like an artistic process, and sometimes I do feel like a lot of the connections almost come from without, if that makes any sense.
Yeah,
Sure.
like it's almost an occult process.
Yes, I mean, I would kind of think it almost more kind of, you know, in the arts corresponding with the muses or something to that effect. But I mean, I kind of feel like some ways that's what I'm doing too.
I like that, referring kind of back to William Cooper. I like that you called this, you're doing this series on the farm called Anti-Mystery Babylon. What do you mean by that? Like,
Yeah, essentially. I mean, he wasn't wrong in suggesting that secret societies have played a large role in shaping human history, which, you know, have been very little remarked upon by credible or academic historians or something to that effect. So that's no doubt true. But in the case of Cooper, I mean, obviously he would go on to promote a lot of just shoddy research and so forth, and a lot of the, kind of common whipping boys of this type of research that have been around for years. I mean, of course, the United States, for instance, has had Illuminati scares literally going back to the time of the founders, and then I believe there was another rekindling of this, like around the time of the First World War and what have you. So, in a sense, I mean, he was kind of bringing out some old war horses when he really started to popularize the concept of the Illuminati again in American conspiracy culture in the late 80s, the early 90s, and so forth. So yeah, I mean, a lot of that is really interesting in and of itself. But I mean, another thing too that I really wanted to try to get into with the Anti-Mystery Babylon series was to go into secret societies and cults that you really don't hear a lot about.
Sure.
One of the ones I'm really excited for that we're going to get Richard B. Spence back is to go into is the Orange Order, which is really crucial because, I mean, when you study this history of these stay-behind armies like I have over the years, you start seeing that these stay-behind armies have been closely associated with secret societies in a lot of different countries. I mean, of course, very famously, you've got Propaganda Dewey in Italy, of course, which was associated with so much of the stay-behinds there during the years of lead and so forth. But, I mean, you also have the Cagoule, who were effectively being used by the French military to erect a kind of stay-behind force in France during the 1930s. You had the Thule Society, who famously raised a lot of the free corps that were used to suppress the communists during the 1920s in Germany, which eventually essentially became the Stormtroopers, the SA, and so forth. So, I mean, you have this long history of these secret societies and these stay-behind armies, and I kind of think the origins of this might have been this kooky Orange Lodge thing, which the British came up with. It was basically designed to ensure the continuation of Scotland and Ireland in the empire. So you basically set these up. They were based on Masonic principles. They tended to recruit heavily from Protestants, especially in Ireland, and they effectively were turned into a paramilitary force at different points by the British. And the Orange Lodge, I mean, was still being used effectively in stay-behind operations up to the 1970s. I mean, it showed up in the horrendous Concord Boys Home scandal. So, it's a very interesting topic. And that's the type of stuff that you really just don't see addressed in these, these things that purport to expose secret societies. And that's really what I wanted to do with the Anti-Mystery Babylon, get into this kind of stuff that I'm guessing Cooper probably knew a lot of this history, but he selectively chose to ignore it. So
yeah, it probably wasn't sensationalist enough for him.
Well, it's not, again, Cooper was a military intelligence officer, Office of Naval Intelligence, right?
Yeah.
So, and I mean, the thing with Cooper, if you listen to some of the stuff he says, he was very fanatical about citing your sources and finding credible sources, all of which, really influenced me when I started on this journey. But when you actually go back and look at the stuff that Cooper was citing, it's crap, So it's like you're left with this, dichotomy with Cooper where it's like, okay, the guy obviously knows how to do a scholarly research on something, but he doesn't do it, so yeah. That's the kind of sophistication that really does go into a lot of these right-wing conspiracy theories, and their proponents and so forth. It's so amazing.
So the Orange Order is kind of a reference. I guess the orange would be the reference of William of Orange.
Yes, absolutely.
Suppose. Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it was. Yeah. I believe it was the first patriarch was William of Orange.
So that relationship between secret societies and intelligence networks, you're almost to the point where they become one and the same. Really, there's not much that is. Are the stay behind armies, which are intelligence networks in and of themselves. I mean, there's just not really much of a difference. And Dr. Future kind of put it to me that the CIA had so much of influence from the Skull and Bones Society that the thing is just like, because of that little silly secret society at Yale, they already knew they could keep secrets.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, that's why I don't think it's that surprising that you do see, especially in the early CIA, that so many of the officers were recruited from these very exclusive orders like Skull and Bones, of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, and that type of thing, for that exact reason that you're alluding to. I mean, they were already used to, these individuals had already been shown that they could keep secrets, that they could function in a clandestine organization. So, yeah, I mean, they would have been a logical choice. And then on top of that, I mean, a lot of these networks were essentially meant to identify, young men at the time from the right sort of background,
pools.
quote unquote, to groom them for eventually, prestigious positions and posts and so forth. So, yeah, I mean, it is a very logical connection that they would make. And I mean, you could also really throw in organized crime for that matter as well. I mean, because again, frequently secret societies delve into organized crime, and certainly intelligence services do. And, essentially the mafia, the Yakuza, they really do function in a lot of ways like secret societies.
Right. They have that veneer, that kind of quasi-religious veneer. They have the strange beliefs that they believe in. And it allows everybody to have this brotherhood, and they believe that they are carrying the secret, and that they know this the secret to their group. And it's just another training ground. I kind of look at it as just like, a lot of people will say, well, the secret society set these up, but like I would just say, no, they're kind of just one and the same. You've got just these guys that come together for whatever nefarious reason, or what they believe is a good reason, and then they begin to build this kind of occult belief system around that. I don't think, there's almost a chicken and egg kind of quality to it, but I think that that's more where it comes from.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, of course, in our, particular history too, I mean, so much of it comes from the British. And as I've, come to realize, especially in researching the Epstein book, I mean, the British are very clever. They're very nefarious. They, do a lot of stuff that might seem utterly ridiculous or nonsensical, but in many cases, there is a very deliberate reason for why it was done. I mean, just when you look at a guy like Sir William Wiseman, who was managing pretty much all of the, what would have been what eventually became MI6, its intelligence network in North America during the First World War. I mean, he was using all kinds of crazy people. I mean, he was using Aleister Crowley as a major infiltration agent against the German services. He had Sidney Riley, the so-called ace of spies, on retainer. He was probably working with Harry Houdini at some point, which also brings up the prospect that Lovecraft himself might have been a part of this network. And I mean, the British would continue to use these occultists well into the Second World War. I mean, we know that from the use of horoscopes and astrology to manipulate Rudolf Hess and so forth. So, yeah, I mean, just the British whole approach to this. I mean, they would really use almost anyone imaginable. I mean, they were probably the ones who cemented the working relationship between the syndicate and U.S. intelligence as well. I mean, certainly William Stevenson made good use of the mafia to liquidate German agents in New York and so forth in the lead up to the Second World War. So,
well, it's all these different connections are just so extremely interesting. I don't want to get too bogged down into Epstein. I know this is kind of a current events kind of thing, especially with Ghislaine Maxwell being, in custody and all this kind of thing. And of course, the joke is that she's going to die next. But apart from Epstein, I mean, she's interesting in and of herself just because of who her father was and the fact of the way that he died. Very mysteriously, and that there was some kind of intelligence connection to that.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, Robert Maxwell, at different times was probably an agent for the Mossad, for MI6, and for the KGB. Just really kind of a classic case. I mean, in many ways, he was almost a modern manifestation of the spy I had just mentioned, Sidney Riley, who had such a strange history. Of course, he was a Russian Jew who had worked for the Tsar secret police. He had worked for MI6. He had later worked for the Cheka, the early intelligence service for the Bolsheviks that became the KGB. He'd even worked for the Germans at a few points, for the Kempetai, the big intelligence service for the Japanese. But a lot of times, that's just how these guys operate and how they survive, essentially. I mean, of course, when you're using double agents in the first place, I mean, they have to be able to give the intelligence service that they're penetrating enough useful information to the point that they're not going to become suspicious. And a lot of times to do that and stay alive, you have to effectively switch sides at certain points. That was really the game that I would guess that Robert Maxwell was playing, because, I mean, all of these intelligence services knew about his double dealing. I mean, Maxwell really solidified his relationship with the KGB in 1954. I mean, he'd had ties to them even before then, but 54, he had a big meeting in Moscow. He negotiated essentially a monopoly on all of the Soviet scientific publications that were coming out at the time. He only got that because the KGB gave the okay for it, and essentially decided that he was one of their boys. And, as soon as he gets back, the British, they knew about all of this. He went there with his secretary, who was having an affair with. She was brought into MI5 essentially to tell them everything that was going on. So from essentially this point onward, they knew that Maxwell was in contact with senior KGB officers, and they effectively continued to use him as a back channel to the Soviet Union all the way up to the time of Thatcher. And I mean, he had a great relationship with Thatcher, which is interesting in and of itself, because he was an avowed socialist, quote unquote, who was, in some sense, a KGB stooge. And yet he was great friends with the Iron Lady. So go figure that. But this is just how these things work in these circles. It's just really bizarre. And, you're seeing traces of that now with Epstein and Ghislaine. I mean, who were they working for? A lot of people want to say that it was the Mossad or the CIA. But again, I kind of think the British are another interesting specter in all of this as well.
And they could have been working for all three.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I would imagine that would be very much the case.
Well, this is what we were talking. Sophie and I were having a conversation yesterday, and we were talking about this. A lot of people think that, especially in the conspiracy world now, that they think that this is all about some kind of certain ideology. And a lot of people, the big boogeyman of socialism or communism, and that's what they think. But like the way this stuff really works, and the way these guys really work, and Maxwell is a perfect example of this, is they just sell themselves off to the highest bidder. And there's no ideology. If there was in the beginning, it wasn't there at the end.
Yeah. I mean, if you get into some of the desk jockeys, I mean, the kind of, the Ivy League types that have been groomed for the upper echelons, I mean, yeah, there might be some ideology there, but certainly the operators, the guys in the actual field, no, I mean, they've got to be flexible. And on top of that, they know that whatever intelligence service that they're working for will sell them out in a heartbeat. They could end up dead at a moment's notice. So, and that, with that kind of in mind, they're always out to get theirs effectively and essentially try to get away an insurance policy, something to the effect that will eventually enable them to get out of the game. So,
and I think like the KGB in particular, they didn't, as far as Western recruits, they didn't like true believers. They wanted more self-interested people.
Oh, yeah.
Who were working for money.
Yeah. I mean, for many years, that was essentially the whole mindset of the KGB. I mean, there was nothing more reliable than a man whose loyalty could be bought for cold, hard cash, essentially. But I mean, it's like, the KGB, it's just incredible. I mean, one of the things I've recently learned is that so many of the early KGB guys had actually worked for the Tsarist secret police. In fact, one of the early heads, it wasn't the KGB at the time, it was whatever it was in the 30s. They changed the name every couple of years until Stalin died.
In KVD, I think.
Yeah, something like that. But I mean, the guy, Yagata or something like that, I mean, he had actually been a Tsarist informant who had worked his way up through the ranks of the Soviet intelligence service to become the head of it in like 1934 or something like that. And he was hardly alone. There were a lot of former Tsarist intelligence officers in the early Soviet intelligence services. And the thing that's really weird is that, when you kind of flash forward to the 1970s and so forth, the KGB was really who drove perestroika through and essentially started to open up the Russian economy to capitalist investment and what have you. And then you have people like Alexander Dugin, the guy who discovered Julie Savoy in I believe it was a KGB library that he needed restricted access for it, and who sort of revived the whole concept of National Bolshevik ideology and that type of thing. Of course, he's continued to be supported by the FSB, one of the predecessors of the KGB in the years afterwards. And he's, of course, now Putin's Putin's quote-unquote Rasputin. Of course, you've got to be careful about these kind of allegations, but he does seem to have some kind of sway in Russian elite circles. And of course, you've got Putin, the supposedly arch-nationalist revolutionary, who's himself a former KGB man. So it's really interesting, I mean, the KGB came from, a lot of cases, Tsar's secret police. It was nonetheless tasked with maintaining the communist revolution. And then essentially in the 1970s, when it came to the realization that communism could not compete in the long run with capitalism, it seems to have instigated a nationalist revolution.
Well, this is a synchronicity, because I was, it's interesting because I was talking to Dr. Future the other night about this too, and I've had the same thought, that because a lot of Dr. Future's research in this Russia book that he hasn't put out, that he talks about how the KGB and the close ties between the KGB and the Russian Orthodox Church, and you think the KGB is representative of a supposedly atheist communist society. But a lot of those guys and a lot of higher ups in the Communist Party were all closet Orthodox. And it almost seemed to me that because of that, at a certain point, the KGB actually were the ones that actually brought the Soviet Union down, because they essentially had become Russian nationalists.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was very much the case. And I mean, again, whether they truly embrace nationalism like they ever truly embrace communism is highly debatable. But I think they saw that that was the expedient thing to do at the time. I mean, the United States, going back to the early 70s, had essentially been telegraphing our next move, which was the fact that we were going to massively ratchet up defense spending to a point that it would destroy the Soviet economy. And once the KGB realized that, well, there's nothing that we could, that they could do to stop that. I mean, they just didn't have the resources to compete with America's economy. So it's time to scrap the whole communist project. It's just not going to work and sustain Russia as a major superpower in the long run. So you got to find something else.
Yeah, it's very similar to how the kind of like the Nazi International started moving resources out in around 1943 when they saw the writing on the wall. Out of Germany.
Absolutely.
Like the Bormann and Skorzeny and all that network.
Yeah, and I mean, it's just really interesting because, I mean, that was really when Maxwell's whole heyday was. I mean, according to the great Geoffrey Gilson, who's a fabulous British researcher, Maxwell was effectively the bagman for the Labour Party during the 1980s off of all the arms deals. And this was a huge thing in the UK in the 1980s. I mean, we talk about the military-industrial complex in the United States, but in a lot of ways it became even more pervasive in the UK under Thatcher. I mean, I think by the mid-90s or something, it was something like 1 out of every 5 people in the UK was involved in the defense industry or something to that effect. It was just absurd. So they managed this with some huge arms deals tied up with the whole Iran-Contra thing in the 1980s. Maxwell was the bagman for these proceeds, and he essentially got the green light from the KGB to, stash these funds in Bulgaria and the banking system there. And at the same time, Bulgaria had just become an absolute hub for organized crime, for drug trafficking. It was absurd. I mean, you basically have heroin that was being used to, addict the Russian army, that was being trafficked out of Afghanistan and so forth through Bulgaria. It was then going into Italy, where the P2 was probably getting a cut of it, being passed on to the Italian mafia, distributed to the rest of Europe. So, yeah, I mean, you basically have this absurd situation where, I mean, it seems like the multiple intelligence services from both the East and West are subsidizing this just enormous arms and drug trafficking scheme that's going on during Iran-Contra. It's being used to devastate the Soviet Union in particular, but the KGB is making phenomenal money off of it. I mean, they're banking it, setting it aside, I mean, basically getting set up for the next phase, more or less. So, yeah, I mean, it's just incredible.
I want to switch gears a little bit here and talk about this concept of synarchy, about what this is, because you guys have talked about a lot about this on your show.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really fascinating subject. A lot of it goes back to St. Yves, something or other. I'm not going to try to destroy the pronunciation of the guy, but I mean, if you look it up, you can find it. But, I mean, I think, though, kind of derived out of Theosophy and the whole concept of the secret chiefs. Yves essentially believed that we should have a kind of government that was ordered around how occult secret societies were theoretically in communion with the secret chiefs. So democracy, it had to go. You needed a kind of council of elect, what eventually became conceived of as technocrats to oversee everything. And they would effectively bring order to society, quote unquote. And, this was just a concept that it really became prevalent initially in occult societies thanks to Papists. He had embraced it, and he had incorporated it into Martinism, which is a very esoteric type of Freemasonry. And to some extent, it's also a very curious one in the sense that it's not especially hostile to Christianity, unlike some of the other branches like the Grand Orient and so forth. In fact, Papists kind of considered himself to be a kind of Christian mystic. And he had actually sort of served as the occult advisor to the Tsarist court before Rasputin's rise during the very early 20th century. And that led to a proliferation of Martinist lodges in Russia in the years leading up to the First World War and the Revolution. And there were a couple of future communist chiefs, Bolsheviks, who were involved in those Martinist lodges. So go figure. But anyway, you end up having the Synarchy doctrine really taking root in France, and it was eventually embraced by another kind of secret society, the Cagoule, which was, as I had alluded to earlier, one of these sort of clandestine networks that was involved in stay-behind efforts. It was being subsidized by the French military as well as the Italian secret services. They were using it to traffic arms to the nationalists in Spain at the time. And in the post, after the Nazis had invaded and conquered France, there was a lot of speculation that some of the Synarchists who had been involved in the Cagoule network had eventually rose to prominence in Vichy, France. That's sort of debatable, but there definitely was a strong network of former Cagulards that were spread all across France, and they really gained a lot of power because they were essentially in both the Axis and the Allied camps, so they were major network for intelligence and so forth. But I mean, the whole concept of Synarchy, you could really argue in a sense that communism was also a variation on this. I mean, effectively, as it was conceived of by the Bolsheviks and Lenin specifically, it was an authoritarian ideology that jettisoned democracy, that believed effectively that you needed a clandestine elite to organize and govern society, which was essentially what the Synarchists wanted. But in a lot of ways, this is also what the Nazis wanted. And this came out of the Thule Society, effectively, which also had embraced the whole concept of the secret chiefs. Of course, it came to Thule via the whole, Ariosophy notion, which essentially could be seen in, well, there were different variations of Ariosophy. You had some of the pagan branches, you had some that were almost kind of like a Gnostic variation, somewhat similar to Christian identity theology, where white Aryans were these divine supermen and the rest of humanity were subhuman demonic races, or something to that effect. Whatever the case may be, it produced a major authoritarian ideology in Nazi Germany, to be sure. So yeah, when you look at this sort of spiritual transformation that was touched off by Theosophy and this doctrine of the secret chiefs, it spread into these different types of ideologies. And I think to some extent it even went into Christianity in the early 20th century. When you look at groups like the Family and the Moral Rearmament movement, again, you're essentially replacing the secret chiefs with Jesus plus nothing or something to that effect, and trying to organize a cabal of key men, so to speak, who, again, are divinely sanctioned to rule society, to bring order between the labor struggle or what have you, and effectively jettison democracy. That's always a big thing with these doctrines. You do not want people actually choosing their own destiny because, they can't do it for themselves, so you need an enlightened or technocratic elite to do it for them.
Wow. Or someone who's divinely ordained or has some kind of communication with the divine, supposedly.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So I kind of thought the one thing I kind of talked to Doc Future with when we finished recording was the Kansas City Prophets. That kind of seems like that might be the emerging version of the secret chiefs within Dominionism, something to certainly keep an eye on.
Or in your most recent show, you guys were talking about this idea of Q being almost like channeled texts.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Q is another one who's really become a kind of, I mean, really a whole network of secret chiefs, really for the alt-right or something to that effect. I mean, yeah, that's definitely something that you could see the parallels there as well. And essentially also ominously kind of conditioning his followers to the whole concept that martial law will be a wonderful thing because it'll give Trump and or the military the ability to finally destroy the satanic pedophiles and so forth.
Right. So when the enemy is when you supernaturalize the enemy, then naturally you're doing the same to yourself. So it basically goes back to this occult concept that really came from like P.B. Randolph and Theosophy of there being this like white versus black lodge, of there being these ascended masters or people on both sides of the veil, both on your side and the other side, and it's crazy that so many people have adopted it when it's essentially this like 19th century occult concept.
Yeah, I mean, it's really amazing how enduring it is, and I mean, especially with the Christian right, really, because I mean, you could almost take it back to Shiite Islam, really, and the whole concept of the hidden Ayman, I believe it is, or something to that effect.
Imam,
Of course,
yes.
Yeah.
in Sunniism, I mean, an Ayman can be pretty much anybody. It doesn't mean much of anything. But in Shiitism, it's very, very serious. I mean, they keep track of the Aymans, and there's some dispute over how many Aymans there were from the time of Muhammad. The two big branches of the Seveners and the Twelvers. The Twelvers are currently the dominant branch, I believe, and who really hold sway in modern day Iran. And then, of course, the Seveners had been dominant up through the Middle Ages, and this is where the Nizriya come from, and then, of course, the infamous Isassians and that type of thing. So, I mean, in and of itself, this is kind of an esoteric doctrine adopted from Islam by Blavatsky and Theosophy that now seems to obsess the Christian right, in turn, who are convinced that, they're about to be conquered by the Islamic hordes being driven by some kind of Marxist elite cabal in the United States or something to that effect. So we've really come full circle in a lot of ways. And then to cap it off, I mean, the Iranians, they believe that when the second coming comes and Jesus comes back, that'll be a wonderful thing because then the hidden Ayman will come back with him. So they want Jesus to come back as much as any Christian fundamentalist in the United States wants him to come back.
He's going to come out of the well.
Yes. Yeah, they're the one Islamic country that they're all convinced is the ultimate personification of evil, rather than the Saudis or something to that effect.
Yeah, there was a group I wanted to ask you about that you pinned into the Synarchist camp, and this one I had never heard of, called the Dark Enlightenment.
Oh, yes. Well, I mean, it's more of a philosophy than a movement, but it essentially kind of came out of a very curious group called the Cybernetic Cultural Research Unit, which was an unofficial faculty movement with some students and what have you at Warwick University in the UK in the 90s. And, they came up with some just really crazy ideals. A big driving philosophy behind them was this whole concept of accelerationism, which effectively held that capitalism and technology should be sped up to the maximum capacity so that they could bring humanity towards this shining new future, which many people in the CCRU believed effectively would lead to the replacement of humanity with something better or something to that effect. Another thing that they became obsessed with was the notion of hyperstition, basically the concept of trying to turn fiction into a reality, which is something that they, at the time, really were seeing happening with the whole the cyberpunk stuff. I mean, I know Chris Knowles kind of jokes about that, how we don't see any cyberpunk anymore because we're effectively living in the cyberpunk future now. So that was something that they were already seeing starting to unfold in the 90s, and they became convinced that, you could do this with all kinds of other fiction. And as I understand it, it kind of led to them almost building a kind of cult within the CCRU around the John Carpenter film In the Mouth of Madness, which is very interesting. But yeah, it was just really kooky. And one of the big proponents of all this stuff was a guy named Nick Land. And Land was a guy who really hitched his wagon into the whole neo-reaction dark enlightenment thing. I mean, he wasn't the guy who coined it, but I mean, he was really one of the individuals, I think, who gave the most elegant defense of it effectively. But Nick Land, I mean, he has just had some incredible theories. I mean, he was a professor at Warwick University in the 90s until he was dismissed, went on to have a nervous breakdown in the early noughts. Certainly, I always wish that there were maybe videos or something floating around there of his lectures. Apparently, in his heyday, he used to do them with jungle music accompanying him in the background while he lay on the floor, stoned out of his mind on meth. So I'm sure they must have been entertaining, if nothing else. Maybe a little hard to hear, though. But yeah, I mean, Land had come up with the whole notion that capitalism had essentially been the creation of an AI from the future that was coming back and had, created capitalism effectively to assemble itself over the centuries. Yeah, so it all sort of went back to this, or it all kind of came around to this notion that we were building this great future in which humanity would be replaced by something that was superior to us.
So in effect, that's kind of a cult, and that's almost Lovecraftian itself.
Oh, yeah. Well, they actually ended up doing a lot of ceremonial magic after they were kicked out of Warwick University. They went into the whole, road with Crowley and Kenneth Grant and the Kabbalah, of course. In fact, I believe they even posted this sort of online Kabbalah thing that was rooted in ceremonial magic, but effectively it's supposed to initiate a lot of incredible synchronicities in whoever is using it, more or less. So yes, it did get into a really occultic doctrine, and they kind of got into the whole Atlantean and Lemurian thing, though unlike a lot of occult groups, they actually saw the Atlanteans as being the evil ones, these pompous individuals who had closely guarded the great mysteries and sciences of humanity for years through their different secret societies and occult orders and so forth. Whereas the CCRU, they were the Lemurians, they were the lords of chaos who were going to take all of this information and give it to the public and just let the cards fall where they, or the chips fall where they may, effectively.
The good guys.
Yes.
Yeah,
No, everybody's the good guys.
Right.
The pure, all things are pure.
Yeah. With any of these groups, they're always the good guys. That's how I know to go the other way when they tell you we're the good guys.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Which I guess another group. Well, go ahead, Sergio.
Well, I was going to ask before we kind of go somewhere else. Is there anything else from that time period in the that kind of early 90s psychedelia and early cyber culture? Are there any other things from that period you think are really neglected and can shine light on what's going on today?
Well, I mean, there's also the whole, another interesting concept the CCRU had was the whole thing with Y2K and what have you. See, they effectively thought that the world had ended in the year 2000, more or less. Which, and really, if you sit down and think about it, in the post, after we had 2000, the world really never was the same. We went from the, highly contested 2000 election between Bush and Gore to 9/11, to the Iraq invasion, to the economic collapse, to
we're pretty much in this multipolar world now, whereas at that time there was still an argument as to whether it was going to be a unipolar world with the United States at the front.
Yeah, well, not just that, but it's just really before the year 2000, there was a general consensus as to, what reality was, more or less.
Yeah.
And that just does not exist anymore. It doesn't. And it's been driven by a lot of things. Certainly the whole cycle of quote unquote fake news and what have you is a big contributor to it, but there just is no consensus on what constitutes reality anymore. And it's just incredible. So,
and almost no historical perspective either.
Yeah. Very well said. I do want to point out that in the John Teeter timeline, the world did end, but it's good that he got that part from that old computer to make sure it didn't happen. Council of National Policy. Now, this has come up a lot, And this is extremely timely because these guys are really have an influence on our culture right now, and especially have an influence on conspiracy culture. And you know, as we're recording this on July 28th, yesterday there was this group of doctors that was taken out and like in front of the Supreme Court, did this little press conference, and they were talking about hydroxychloroquine. And it was put on by the Tea Party Patriots. Was that right, Sergio? We found out they are associated with the Council of National Policy. So who are these people?
Well, they are certainly a great mystery. They really began to emerge in the 1980s. And I think effectively a lot of that was driven, at least in part, by the exposure of the American Security Council for really a lot of years, at least since the mid-1950s and so forth. I mean, the ASC was really the flagship for the far right in the United States. I believe one researcher described it as the soul, if not the very heart, of the military-industrial complex. I mean, it pretty much all of its donors were the major defense companies of the time. It was staffed almost exclusively with former military, FBI, and intelligence officers. And it also functioned as essentially a private intelligence network as well. I mean, a big part of what it did was blacklisting. It compiled massive amounts of dossiers on Americans, I think something like 4 million at its peak or something to that effect. And it also got involved in a lot of shady stuff, just pedophile networks, drug trafficking, arms trafficking, the whole, works. So the ASC, though, had managed to really avoid a lot of public scrutiny for decades. I mean, I think it got a decent write-up in Power and the Right by William Turner around 1970. That was the first really lengthy account of it. And it was maybe dealt with here and there by Peter Dale Scott, maybe some of the other JFK assassination researchers. But you really did not hear a lot of it until the 1980s, when you had books like, Old Nazis, The New Right, and the Republican Party by Russ Bellunt, and a few other works that came out in that era that really shone a light on it. And it seems like with these types of groups, when they start to become really high profile, they're allowed effectively to die, and their assets are effectively transferred into more clandestine, or what at the time were more clandestine groups. And with the ASC, it seems like a lot of the more reputable, at least as far as these things go in this types of circles, are the more reputable elements went into a group that's called the Center for Security Policy, which is a really big deal in this day and age too. It's headed by Frank Gaffney, and they have been one of the groups, for instance, has been massively pushing the whole ban on Muslims in the United States and that type of thing for years now. The Center for Security Policy is also probably the group that's behind the what I think this would be the Committee for the Present Danger Mach 4 at this point. I think they're calling it, the Committee for the Present Danger China. Generally speaking, we've had, whenever the Committee for the Present Danger comes back, you're screwed. Like, the first one was brought out, I think, around 1950, and it was essentially the lobby group to enshrine the national security state when there was some dispute over whether or not we needed a permanent national security state. So the CPD was dispatched to convince the public that it was in fact necessary. Then it was revived again in the 1970s when we decided we needed a more militant foreign policy, and especially to sort of pave the way for the Strategic Defense Initiative in Star Wars and the whole thing we were talking about earlier about bankrupting the Soviet economy. So that was what the CPD was up to in the 70s, and then it was brought back again in the early noughts, to drum up the jingoism for the, war against Islam or that type of thing. And then more recently, it's been brought back yet again to start rallying the troops for the new Cold War with China. So, yeah, CPD is just absolutely evil. And it's not surprising that it would be the Center for Security Policy that would be driving it in this day and age. So that was one of the groups. groups, the Center for Security Policy tends to be more neocon oriented, which is in keeping with the Committee for the Present Danger, since the 70s version 1, not Mach 2, is what really launched the neoconservative movement in the first place. Now, the Council for National Policy is where a lot of the old far right drifted into after the ASC started to be exposed. The big guy, or one of the big guys who funded it in the early years, was Nelson Bunker Hunt of the infamous Hunt family of Texas. I believe it was Houston, where they were based out of. But the Hunts, they have been funding far right causes for decades, going back to Old Man Hunt, and a lot of his children got into the act. Bizarrely, the team that I rooted for growing up in football, the Kansas City Chiefs, is owned by the Hunt family. That was a bit distressing when I learned about that. It's kind of interesting. I read that the Kansas City Prophets, one of the guys that apparently projected that the end times, you would know the end times would be ushered in when the Kansas City Chiefs won the Super Bowl, which they did during this year.
Oh.
Yeah. So
we have them to blame, huh?
Yes, apparently. Yes, and of course, Chiefs fans, we've been long suffering for many years. It was the first Super Bowl Kansas City have won in 50 years or something to that effect. So it is kind of, once in a lifetime type event to see the Chiefs win the Super Bowl anyway. So who knows? But the Hunt family, just phenomenally wealthy. They sponsored a lot of far right causes. They were one of the big early backers of the Council for National Policy. Another one was the Coors family. Of course, the major brewing magnates, They were another one of the major sponsors for the sort of right-wing revolution that began to emerge in the 1970s. And it also brought in a lot of the Dominionist types and what have you, along with the type of conventional, or I guess I shouldn't say conventional, the type of far-right Republicans you would expect to see associated with it. A major one was Larry McDonald, for instance, the guy who died in Flight 007 in 1983 that almost touched off another nuclear war.
Yeah.
So
the Korean airline. Yeah.
KLA 007. Yes, I mean, he was an early member of this group with a lot of the, usual suspects that you find in these kind of circles. Some other interesting things about the CNP that I've found out from some recent research, they kind of seem like they might have been one of the groups involved in sponsoring some of these stay-behind organizations effectively in America. I believe it was one of the CNP members, Messlinger or something like that. Shoot, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but he was effectively seems to have been one of the guys who was sponsoring the Civilian Material Assistance Group, which was a far-right paramilitary group. It was also tied in with an even more militant one, the Phantom Brigade or something to that effect. I think it was the Phantom Division, but they were based out of Memphis. Both of these groups were comprised almost entirely of former special operations soldiers, not regular military. And the CMA specifically was heavily involved in arms trafficking during the Iran-Contra era, which has led to a lot of speculation that they were effectively a CIA front to begin with. But, like I said, they also were tied in with a lot of these paramilitary groups. They had links to the Order of St. John, one of these infamous secret societies that I've talked about a lot on the farm. The Sovereign Order of St. John actually seems like it was one of the major groups that was tasked with running the American stay-behind groups for years to begin with. And incidentally, Larry McDonald was a member of the Sovereign Order of St. John. I've got actually a collection of his personal papers where he talks about that. So, yeah, you had these kind of clandestine things that were going on with Iran-Contra, with these stay-behinds. And that was a big deal during the Reagan years. I mean, this is when they had started to come up with the whole Rex 84 thing. And I do think there's a good chance that that's one of the reasons why the militia culture really started to take off in that era. I mean, they had anticipated that there could be massive civil unrest. And these militia groups, I mean, they have a long history of being used to disperse that kind of stuff in this country, going back to the American Protective League during the First World War.
Mm-hmm.
So almost set up as kind of like in a certain way of like a continuity of government. We could use these guys kind of thing.
Oh, yeah.
In case Red Dawn happened.
Yeah, essentially. Well, I mean, that was the same kind of concept with the European stay-behind ones. I mean, effectively, you know, in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, the early Cold War, there was this perspective that a war with the Soviet Union was inevitable. So there would be a nuclear exchange that would knock out most of the major cities in Europe and what have you. And then we would drop the Green Berets in, and they would link up with all of these stay-behind units that we had been setting up. And these would be the groups that would go out and destroy what was left of the Soviet army for us. And presumably the same type of thing was planned here, where we would have cities that would be knocked out, so there would be a lot of civil unrest. So, you know, we can use the Green Berets here too, and they'll link up with these militias and what have you, and provide us with a ready-made security force.
That is an interesting thought. I've never thought of it that way.
I have declassified documents on the CMA from the FBI, which talks about a certain special forces group specifically working with the CMA. And this is a special forces group I have credible links to training Ku Klux Klan members and what have you in the 1960s. So, yeah, that definitely seems like this was very much a thing where these Green Berets and these other special operations forces were working with these far-right groups in these stay-behind efforts. Because, I mean, the document I have specifically talks about how these things would be initiated in the event of a nuclear war. The special forces group specifically, that's what they were designed for. They were domestic, and that's another interesting thing. They were a domestic-oriented special forces group, a Green Beret outfit that was going to be deployed in the event of a nuclear war and was working with these far-right militias. So you do the math.
So in absence of an invasion force in a Cold War, what does stay behind, what does that really mean for today, or what are the implications for it? It seems like it would mean a domestic political situation.
Yeah, well, I mean, that was essentially what, you know, they were looking at with Rex 84. I mean, at that point in time, they had kind of realized there probably wouldn't be an actual hot war, but the things related to the Cold War and destruction of the Soviet Union might cause a lot of civil unrest, the type of thing we're seeing now, a lot of rioting and what have you. So what happens if the police forces and what have you become overwhelmed? Well, you've got to use the military, but I mean, you know, we have all of these, almost 200 countries in the world we have military bases in, or something to that effect. You know, we've got a lot of other military commitments around the world, so we can't just deploy our troops en masse, so we've got to have some auxiliaries to help them out a little bit. So one source would definitely be these militias, which incidentally almost always are comprised of ex-military and law enforcement people as their core members. So, you know, that's a very convenient place to look for. And another one obviously would be private contractors.
Yes, which kind of brings...
it all relates to what is exactly happening right now.
Yes. And the last interview that we did with you, we didn't really realize that this was probably going to happen, but we talked about Eric Prince and formerly Blackwater, and how there's essentially a private army being assembled. And now what's going on in Portland and what's about to happen as we're recording this in other cities. This is essentially what we're seeing. Some of these feds that are being sent to these cities are actually paramilitary and
private.
Essentially mercenaries that are being hired.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you know, they already kind of laid the ground for this, especially in the during the Obama years with the the Dakota Access protests. Eventually, the company hired Tiger Swan, I believe is what it was called, a PMC, to go after the protesters. And, you know, I mean, this is a big deal. I mean, Tiger Swan was founded by ex-members of the Delta Force. And they're specifically saying that we're going to start employing the counterinsurgency tactics that we were using in, you know, the numerous wars we've been fighting for the last 20 years or so domestically. And that should really scare the hell out of everybody. Mm-hmm. But it really just didn't seem to register at the time. So now, unfortunately, we're going to the next level. Now we're actually starting to see a lot of this civil unrest and what have you developing that the military has been, wargaming for essentially for the last decade or so now. It's finally starting to happen. And they're going to the people that I think they have really been setting up for this task, and that is these private military companies. I mean, these are almost all staffed with former special operations forces, a lot of guys from SEAL Team 6, from Delta Force, and their whole thing is counterinsurgency, which is exactly what you would be doing for large-scale unrest here. Counterinsurgency, that's what this whole doctrine was developed for. The U.S. military has been refining it now, really for decades, but especially in the last, 19, 20 years now since 9/11 happened. You have all of these veterans now that have been brought into these private military companies, and you have all the guys, from the UK, I mean, even from Chile and a whole bunch of other countries that they've been recruited from. It's kind of ironic, actually. I mean, all the years that the far right was, warning about troops from China or whatever being brought in under the auspices of the UN. Well, probably when we do get the foreign troops here, they're going to come in the form of these private military companies, which do recruit very heavily from foreign services. So, yeah, I mean, you're going to start seeing probably more and more of this going forward, especially with the police forces being overwhelmed and essentially afraid to really do much of anything. So now you start bringing out the private contractors who, among other things, also give you another level of legal deniability. You can always blame the company if stuff goes wrong. So.
Sure. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. One of the things that I've noticed, and this is a sensitive subject, but one of the things I've noticed in some of the mass shootings that have taken place, especially the one in Orlando at the nightclub, that guy was directly associated with one of these like private contractors, security contractors. And there just always seems to be like this weird kind of element that I can't really quite put my finger on whether some of that stuff is, like the conspiracy theorists say, that there is some kind of false flag thing going on there.
Yeah, I mean, it is something that, you really do have to consider, because, once again, if you were going to run a false flag, a PMC would be a logical entity to use for such a thing, because on the one hand, they have access to highly trained former military personnel, and on the other hand, they do give you a level of plausible deniability if any of this stuff ever actually does come out. But yeah, there's a lot of interesting connections with the whole thing in Florida. You could also look at the Las Vegas shooting, which I think is another one that's very sketchy as well. And in the case of the Vegas guy, he was essentially an arms trafficker, basically. So
yeah, that's what it really seems like, and that's really what it obviously seemed to be. And the police have come out and said that that they don't know, but there was a lot of weird stuff with that you were seeing come out, and the same with the Orlando. I guess that was 2 years before that. There was just such weirdness that I think part of the Orlando stuff was the police went in there and I think they went in with guns blazing, and they might have actually killed some of the people inadvertently. I think that was part of it.
Well, then, of course, they had the shooting later at the school, I think, effectively, where the police, refused to do anything more or less.
Well, what was, and I remember this really specifically, what was strange about that Orlando nightclub shooting was that singer was killed the night before by this crazed fan.
Oh, yes.
That shot her, and her brother like wrestled him down to the ground. And then he killed himself.
Yeah.
And that was bizarre. It was almost just like that was supposed to have been it, but then it failed, so somebody went to plan B. And I'm really not saying that this is like the Democrats are doing because they want to take your guns. What I'm saying is just more like who are these private military these security contractors? Who are they working for? You just don't know. You don't know what agenda is being these people that are just in the shadows.
Well, and I mean, in a lot of ways, it makes sense for the private military industry from an economic standpoint as well, because I mean, really, it creates more business for them with these, I mean, if theoretically, if they are involved in some of these mass shootings, because a lot of times, what happens when they occur at a nightclub or, a Vegas casino or something like that? Well, they decide to hire more private security. So,
Yeah.
it's a major
Yeah,
boom.
and
That's a good point.
it reminds me of, like you were talking about, the way that so many members of the KGB were responsible for things that ultimately led to the dissolution of the USSR is part of what we're seeing now. This push for decentralization, this strategy of tension. Is this to empower the only ones who are going to be, left, which are the private security companies? Like, this kind of feudal, chaotic world is what they flourish in.
Yeah, well, I mean, it really does make you wonder, because like we were talking about earlier before with these spies, not the desk jockeys, but the guys who are working in the field. And a lot of times these type of people are special operators in the first place, because they're really the only guys that have the kind of training to survive for extended periods of time and the type of circumstances that these deep cover guys get into. But anyway, so these guys, I mean, they all have ultimately dubious loyalties, and they effectively have to survive in the first place. And what happens in a lot of cases is that the spies and the special operators become closer to one another and collaborating together than the intelligence services that they're theoretically working for. So now you fast forward to the 1980s, or, the aftermath of that, the Cold War ends. I mean, all of these, these ex-KGB guys and their equivalent in special forces, they're released from their services. Theoretically, you have the same thing happening in the U.S., and the Russians, they start forming private military companies too. A really interesting one in that regard is Far West Limited, which has also been linked to 9/11, interestingly, and that had a lot of interesting people involved with it. The big arms dealer, what's his name, Kasabi or whatever, the Saudi, oh shoot, I can't remember his name now, but he was a guy involved with them. What was it? Halliburton, I believe, was actually a stockholder in it. So that connects up with Cheney and all that other kind of stuff. But I mean, okay, so you've got this situation where you've got these private military companies. You've got former Russian KGB and special forces guys working in them. You've got former, intelligence and military guys from South Africa, from the United States, from Israel, from the UK, and so on and so forth. It's this vast network. All of these guys are now openly collaborating together, and they start, that you brought them all together in this very profitable industry. So what happens if they start thinking about the future? Well, what happens, if they start eroding the governments more? I mean, they know how to do it. They just spent the, the whole Cold War era destabilizing governments and what have you. Well, what if you keep pushing for this more and more? That's only going to empower this private network even more so and make things even more profitable and lucrative for them. And I mean, I think that's, I always kind of point at it, but when you look at the Trump administration, I really think that whole SCL Cambridge Analytica network is what you need to focus on, because that was what was behind Brexit as well. It was a huge force in bringing Trump to power here in the United States. It's a British company, but it's linked in, to American CMP types like the DeVos family and Steve Bannon. It's linked into the Israelis and their intelligence services with the Mossad and what have you. There's also, I mean, it's not as firm, but there's a good chance that there's probably some Russians involved with it. It seems like there's some nationalist Chinese through the Eric Prince faction involved with it. So basically, you've got this network of ex-military and intelligence officers centered around SCL Cambridge Analytica that really initiated Brexit and Trump. Are they doing this because they're genuinely nationalists, or is it for an agenda of their own, essentially? I mean, that makes an interesting question. Really, it's very ominous with the world that we're currently living in now.
Yeah, there's an agents of chaos kind of aspect to it too.
Yeah, but I mean, it does make you wonder, did all of these spooks and these special operators, sit down and finally decide, look, we're sick and tired of making these corporations all of this money. I mean, we know how to destabilize the world, essentially. I mean, we've been trained to do it for decades now. We've seen it done in practice. We've done it ourselves. Why don't we just do that? I mean, in all the chaos, we're the ones who are really going to make a killing out of all of it, ultimately.
Yeah.
The closest, I want to say real quick, the closest failed state that to us, of course, is our southerly neighbor Mexico. And what does the situation look like there for private security and military? I'm sure is probably booming.
I'd add probably Brazil to that too.
Yeah, no, I would imagine certainly. I want to say, I think in South America, I mean, that was already a big industry there for the American companies, because I mean, obviously CEOs and executives for these companies that are working there, I mean, they've been targets for kidnapping for years now. I mean, really going back, I think, to like the 70s or the 80s when that really started to become a big thing. So I mean,
that's a huge thing in Brazil. They kidnap people left and right.
Yeah, I mean, the private military companies have already been making a lot of money off of that for decades, and in fact, they even made that movie essentially glorifying the one company. I think like Russell Crowe was in it, maybe Meg Ryan, Proof of Life or something like that, maybe.
Okay, yeah, I was thinking maybe you're talking about the movie where the one with Chris Hemsworth that Netflix put out.
No, this was this was actually before private military companies became a big thing. I think it was released like the late 90s, very early noughts or something like that. But
that's essentially what that movie is about. I forget the name of it, Extreme Measures or something like that. But he's essentially a mercenary that
But yeah, I mean, that's been a big industry for a lot of these PMCs, especially the British ones, really, for a lot of years. I think it was like Controlled Risks and Keeny Meeny and those type of groups have been active in the Latin American countries for a very long time now. So, yeah, and I mean, I would imagine just the whole situation the world's going in now, I mean, it's only going to mean even more money. I mean, in Mexico especially, I mean, you have a situation where, I mean, a lot of cases the drug cartels are better armed and trained than the police and the military even are. So
yeah, all this really makes me think of do you remember the television show Jericho? Do you remember that?
I love Jericho.
So I mean, that was basically the plot, was just like there was a private military company that caused all the cities to be destroyed in the by nuclear weapons, and they essentially were taking the country over.
Yeah, trying to reconstitute with a new, essentially corporate form of government or something to that effect. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, certainly it does seem like a rather prophetic series in the 21st, the most recent decade. Sadly, I think it only lasted like 2 seasons. Though.
Yeah, that's pretty much 1.5 seasons. But so there's a concept that I wanted to talk to you about. We talked a little bit about this with David Metcalf, kind of on a Patreon episode, but he kind of brought this up. And I hear it referred to as 4th generation, and I also hear it referred to as 5th generation. But the concept of this kind of like warfare that's based on just muddying the waters of information. And I really think that's what we're really under right now.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, it's really, it's just another variation on political warfare, ultimately, or psychological warfare, depending upon, what you want to call it. But again, I mean, I think a lot of this, especially in the United States, it was a long-term project that, like a lot of things, went back to the American Security Council. They had this, what was it? It was called the Institute for American Strategy. It was sort of related to the American Security Council. I mean, it had essentially a lot of the same guys. John Fisher, for instance, who was the longtime chairman of the ASC, was also like the main guy in the Institute for American Strategy. But theoretically, they were separate until I think like the 70s when they merged into one another. But that was probably more of a plausible deniability than anything. But the thing with the Institute for American Strategy, I mean, it was highly staffed with a lot of psychological warfare officers. And there were some interesting guys in there. One of them who was working with it was Stefan Pizzoni, who was essentially the architect of the Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars, and all that stuff. But the interesting thing about this guy, man, he had a long-term interest in the UFO question as well, and he was also on the Robertson panel, the infamous Robinson panel, I think from like 51 or 52 or something like that. But that was, the big meeting that the different intelligence services had about the UFO question. And their whole thing was essentially that the American public needed a massive propaganda blitz in regards to the UFO question, which was interesting because there was only one psychological warfare officer who was active in the entire Robinson panel, and that was Stephen Pisoni, who would go on to work with the American Security Council, which had enormous ties to the UFO movement. They had multiple members who were on NICAP. They were the agency or the entity that was really behind spreading the mythos for Hangar 18. They were involved in spreading the mythos for Area 51. Just years and years of manipulation of the UFO movement. Okay, another guy involved with the Institute for American Strategy was Edward Lansdale. General Edward Lansdale, psychological warfare officer par excellence, who also embarked upon a lot of very strange methods of psychological warfare overseas. For instance, when he was in the Philippines, he became notorious for having his men puncture holes in the necks of dead insurgents, hang them from trees, and drain them blood so that the natives would think that vampires had killed them.
Yeah.
At one point, he wanted to target insurgents in a village there, so he sent his men in and had them paint Masonic all-seeing eyes on the doors across from the suspected insurgents.
It's very much a precursor to the Phoenix program.
Oh, yes. No, Lansdale was an early advisor on that kind of stuff. But, I mean, the big thing you got to remember with Lansdale, he was all about using the superstitions and myths of the people that he was targeting in his psychological warfare operations. So the question kind of becomes, when he's brought back to the United States and involved in crafting psychological warfare for the American Security Council network, would he do the same thing here? Well, I think he definitely would have. And that's really interesting because pretty much all of the conspiratorial right stuff comes out of the American Security Council. I mean, there was massive overlap with the ASC and the John Birch Society, which is where all of your anti-UN, your anti-Federal Reserve type conspiracy theories come from. There was a lot of overlap with the Liberty Lobby, which is where a lot of your Holocaust denial and anti-Semitic type conspiracy theories come from. And there was a lot of overlap with the Minutemen, which was sort of the foundation for what became the Posse Comitatus, the free men on the land, and of course the militia culture. So you could kind of go back and look at this and think, well, maybe the American Security Council created a lot of these alternative movements, which is really ominous when you look at the fact that it seems like a lot of them were being directed by full-blown psychological warfare officers. And they would keep adding to their collection of this. Another interesting guy who ended up working for the ASC in the 1980s was a psychological warfare officer who went by the name of Colonel Michael Aquino. Michael Aquino, the author of From PSYOP to Mind War, which he co-wrote with his commanding officer at the time, a guy who went on to become a general. He was Paul Valvoli. And incidentally, Paul Valvoli is the highest-ranking military officer to come out and claim that the QAnon collective is real and are actually former military intelligence officers. Isn't that incredible? The guy who wrote From PSYOP to Mind War with Michael Aquino is promoting QAnon, who are telling you that Trump is going to initiate martial law to destroy the satanic pedophiles.
Yeah, you talk about taking advantage of the superstitions of your target.
Yeah. Well, this is kind of like a bit of a preview, too, for what I'm going to get into with Strange Realities Gone. So I don't want to give too much away. But, yeah, you guys can kind of see, though, there's really some interesting things with how the superstitions of the American public have been manipulated. And I think, you're just seeing it, just being a massive uptick of it, and especially since the beginning of the 21st century. And some of that, I think was almost inevitably due to the rise of the internet. I mean, just now people have access to so much more information than they have at any other time in human history, really. So, how do you counter that? Well, you just keep feeding them more and more bullshit. That's really the only thing you can do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, we talked a lot about, like, there's the Russian troll farm and there's all that, but like a lot of things that get shared on social media, especially Facebook, are memes, and they really just boil things down to like simple points. There's nothing complex about them. And some of the ones that we've noticed, and like we've noticed a lot of this lately, especially as it deals with the whole Pizzagate / QAnon thing, which is really kind of the same thing continued, is just like this whole, like, you were talking about demonically spiritualizing your opponents. I mean, that's essentially what is being done when you're saying that the other side of the political fence are essentially all child molesting baby, Satanist baby eaters, and that's essentially what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, you're essentially trying to rally people for a crusade. I mean, that's really what you're talking about,
Right. And I think a lot of the concentration on the child abuse stuff is just Adam's always talking about how it seems like just to get that, animal part of people's brains. It's like just the most gut.
Brain.
Yeah.
No, I mean, absolutely. And I mean, it's not to say that the Clintons aren't evil. I mean, I certainly think that they are evil. But I mean, yes, we've just gotten to the point where they have become just a full-blown caricature. And I mean, when you really even get back to this just whole mythos around the Clintons, I mean, it was all bankrolled by Richard Mellon Scaife, who was another, former CIA guy who had also invested a ton of money in these far-right causes over the years. He was another guy like the Hunt family and that type of thing, the Coors family, certainly the same level. So again, the whole mythos of the Clintons is the ultimate personification of evil comes from a right-wing backer and former CIA guy asset, essentially. So, yeah, it's just, it's a bunch of theater when you really get down to it. It really is. And it's just, it's amazing that, I mean, it's had this kind of sway and this sort of mainstream acceptance now. I mean, I had to go back effectively and rewrite the intro of my Epstein book, the first installment in the series for Epstein, just to kind of note the fact that through QAnon, this kind of stuff has gained just unprecedented mainstream acceptance now.
Yeah, and that's not to say that definitely Epstein happened. You've got cases like the Omaha case.
You mean the Nebraska case?
Yeah,
Franklin.
Yeah, Franklin cover-up, all that. I mean, all that stuff has been there's paper trails for all that.
Yeah,
even the Finder's case, as weird as it is, there's paper trail for all that.
Oh yeah. No, my buddy John Brisson is actually working on a book on that, which I think is just going to be excellent. But I mean, this stuff does
good
happen.
Propaganda has a basis in truth.
Absolutely. Yeah. This is what I always tell people. And I mean, even, when you get to the occult stuff, there is a basis for that. I mean, the big part of the first Epstein book is really going to focus on Profumo, and there's all kinds of weird stuff going on with Profumo, trust me. So, I mean, there is a basis in reality for this stuff. But I mean, just what QAnon has done with it, just the absurd levels that it's been taken to, it's incredible. I mean, it really is.
Yeah. Well, and even if some real information is exposed in the process, still knowing who the source of this information is and who is pushing this agenda and what goals they're trying to accomplish by using it. I mean, it doesn't matter if there is actual truth in it. You can still be being manipulated by someone else with truth, even.
Yeah, Sergio,
selective truth.
The idea of the QAnon as being kind of an alternate reality game.
Yeah. And I mean, it kind of goes back to what I was talking about before. I mean, it's just another, tool that's being used to really effectively break down the fabric of reality. Mm-hmm. What have we once all had a consensus reality, and that doesn't exist anymore. And it's, the process of this has only been sped up because of this stuff like QAnon and what have you.
Yeah, it seems like it's a chaotic environment that's being created to facilitate this kind of psy war, to make it more easier to do, just like in the same way that you would destabilize a country in the actual, where the actual police forces did not have control or the military didn't have control, then you could run militias or do whatever you wanted. This is creating that type of information environment that facilitates this type of information war, that lets you conduct your information war.
Yeah, and I mean, this is something, I mean, the alt-right is just all about. I mean, they pretty much have telegraphed it with the whole, shitlords thing and what have you. I mean, it really is just basically coming out and proclaiming that you're a lord of chaos. I mean, we're even essentially seeing chaos magic weaponized by the alt-right for this purpose in and of itself. So, I mean, yeah, we are just seeing some really unprecedented. I mean, I'm sure there's probably a precedent for this type of thing in antiquity or something like that, but there's just sort of open, really just magical war that's playing out. Because, I mean, really, when you get down to it, political warfare, 4G, W, psychological warfare, it really is just a form of weaponized magic, which again is something I'm going to get into the Strange Realities Con, so I don't want to say too much about that, but it is effectively a kind of weaponized magic.
Yes.
We've been looking into, well, we had a really great UFO roundtable on Leah Haley, who was originally an abductee, I guess, who changed her story more into like a mind control thing. And we were kind of exploring this idea that the UFO world, I know we were touching on some of this earlier, but it was like perhaps it was just like a petri dish, and still is, for learning how to conduct these type of operations, learning how to create belief in people, spread memes. And have you heard of this guy, Colonel John B. Alexander?
Oh, yeah. Very familiar with Mr. Alexander.
Yeah. And he came up in this as being pretty closely tied to some of these people, ex-military people who were involved in MUFON down there in Florida, where this case had happened. And so, even continuing on what's going on now in the UFO world, it seems like these same type of operations.
Yeah, and I mean, Alexander, these are the kinds of people, when you really pull back the curtain, you find running the whole UFO movement. And I mean, an interesting thing about Alexander is he's also considered to be one of the pioneers of quote unquote non-lethal warfare.
Yeah.
And I mean, again, there's an interesting thing about that. So Alexander was really known when he hooked up with, General Albert Stubbeline, or whatever it is, in the 1980s. This is when he was at INSCOM, and they were doing the spoon bending parties for the upper brass and going to the Monroe Institute so they could learn how to remote view and all that good stuff. Okay, so how did Alexander hook up with Stubbeline? Well, that's an interesting story that he gets into in his book on UFOs. The guy who put them in contact together was General Richard Stilwell. Stilwell had a fascinating career, to put it mildly. Let's see. He was heavily involved in setting up the opium trafficking in Asia in the 1950s, and Thailand and what have you, working with the KMT to help, sponsor the Chinese nationalists by selling heroin in the United States and what have you. From there, he ended up going to Vietnam about a decade or so later and became a major figure in the Phoenix program. He also helped set up the Joint Special Operations Command, which was, I've talked about that in my book, but that's another great outfit. So Stilwell, did a lot of fascinating things, drug trafficking, arms trafficking, setting up clandestine militaries, all that kind of good stuff. And this was the guy who put Alexander and Stubbeline in contact with each other. According to Alexander, he also had a keen interest in UFOs for whatever reason. Now, fast forward about to the end of the 1980s. Now, Alexander and Stilwell are both out of the military, and they end up in an interesting organization called, the U.S. Global Security Council, I believe. It was another one of these groups that came out of the dissolution of the American Security Council, effectively. I mean, almost all of the guys with it had strong ties to the ASC, like Admiral Thomas Moore, Ray Klein, who was an infamous CIA officer. He had helped set up the World Anti-Communist League, which was kind of the international version of the American Security Council. You had a bunch of people with the Unification Church who were tied into all of this. So just really, really far right circles in the USGSC. And here you have John Alexander working for them specifically to promote non-lethal warfare. And I mean, he's in here with like Donald Rumsfeld and what have you. And incidentally, the first Secretary of Defense to actually sponsor non-lethal warfare was Richard Cheney, who signed off on it when he was the Secretary of Defense under Bush 1. So I've always kind of wondered about that because Cheney and Rumsfeld were, of course, really buddy-buddy. And Alexander is in the USGSC with Rumsfeld in the early 90s, while Cheney is the Secretary of Defense. So yeah, you got to kind of wonder if there were some strings pulled for that to start getting some of Alexander's pet projects funding. But yes, I mean, Alexander is another guy who came out of the same network that I've been describing earlier, and he is yet another one of these characters who ends up running the UFO movement. He's also involved in the Association of Former Intelligence Officers in the Las Vegas chapter with Colonel Michael Aquino. Or at least he was. There's some speculation Aquino's about to die, hopefully. I shouldn't say hopefully.
Yeah, I think I heard
he did die. Yeah.
Oh, he did die. Okay.
Yeah.
The only thing that I'm really sad about that is I really wanted to interview Aquino, but doesn't look like I'm gonna get a chance to do that. Yeah.
Or wait, he didn't die, right? He was
he's preparing to ascend or something like that, maybe.
Yeah, because they have the whole Egyptian thing going on.
Apparently, yes, he wasn't supposed to ascend until September 1st. So, yeah, I had been thinking about trying to email somebody there anyway and maybe see if I could get a deathbed confession or something like that. You know, there's always a chance.
I would love to ask him about
he's floating around. One of the 3 aspects of his soul, I guess, has achieved immortality. So maybe you could just channel it.
It's his ka. his ka. Yeah. Yeah, I would love you to ask him about his Star Wars fan fiction.
Oh yes, gosh, yeah, he wrote.
You know about that?
The Return of the yeah. He actually wrote like a fan fiction about the Sith, and it was really interesting because I think when he wrote that, the only reference to the Sith had been in like the tie-in book for the first Star Wars or something like that, and he immediately latched onto the concept of the Sith. So yeah,
like
great.
Darth Vader was the hero of the whole of his fan fiction.
Yeah. Well, that's pretty much in keeping from a guy who described National Socialism as what the ultimate personification of political power or something to that effect.
Yeah. Yeah. I tell you, there's a lot of interesting stuff about Aquino. I mean, you getting into, and I know we can kind of like stumble into the satanic panic stuff a little bit with him, but there's some weird stuff with the Presidio and all that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I've always been reluctant, though, to really think that Aquino was too closely involved in that kind of stuff for the simple reason that the guy was practically like a cartoon villain or something to that effect. I mean,
yeah,
you would surely, think that he would keep a lower profile if he was actually running like a child abuse ring or something. I mean, this is all like unfolding at the same time that he's like appearing on Oprah dressed up like Bela Lugosi or something like that. And
he looks more like Uncle Fester.
Yes, it's just like, really? Like,
was he on the Geraldo Rivera?
It wouldn't surprise
special?
me.
I think he made the circuit. Yeah, he made the circuit, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, I mean... Yeah, no, he did his first talk show. It was like Phil Donahue back like in the early 70s, I think, when Donahue was like still based out of like, what was it, Drayton, Ohio or something like that. Yeah. So no, he had been doing the whole highly theatrical thing for many, many decades. Which is why, yeah, it seems, I mean, well, it was definitely an act. I mean, there's no doubt about that. But I mean, yeah, this guy was already like a celebrity within like conspiracy circles in the 1980s before his name even started to get leaked and enlarged to the press and what have you.
Well, I mean, like the Satanism is one thing, but then his links to being a psychological warfare specialist. I mean, that's the part that a lot of people don't hop.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, just like UFOs, could be this petri dish. I mean, we've already been talking about the occult and secret societies. I mean, I'm sure it's a great pool. It's a great grounds to do all kinds of operations. So he was probably more. I'm sure he had his own dark spirituality, but he was probably very interested in just those implications.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was definitely a big part of what it was engaged in. It was certainly an aspect of psychological warfare, no doubt. I don't want to get into that too much, but I've gotten an examination, a really in-depth examination about what actually, in terms of psychological warfare, Kino might have been up to with the occult that I'm working on right now.
Interesting.
And
Wow.
you're also, because we're kind of winding down here, so I know you got to get going in a little bit, but you're also helping out the Penny Royal guys too.
Oh yeah,
Recently.
yeah. No, that's going to be great. And that all kind of plays into this as well, because I mean, there was a lot of weird occult stuff that was going on in that whole area, and then up into Ohio in the 1970s. Obviously, you had Aquino there in Louisville, and that kind of quasi civil war that the Church of Satan had in Drayton, Ohio, that Aquino was involved in, and then you had a strange group of Kenneth Grant disciples that were active around Cincinnati and maybe had ended up going down into Kentucky that we're kind of looking into. So yeah, some very strange stuff all going in there. And then of course Cincinnati in and of itself was a city that was founded by a member of a secret society you don't hear a lot about. That was the Society of Cincinnatus.
Yeah.
So it was founded by that, and its most prominent family was probably the Taft family, who immigrated there from New England. And guess who was a co-founder of Skull and Bones? Alfonso Taft. So very interesting legacy of secret societies in that whole area.
All these different connections. Well, Recluse, this has been fascinating, man. It's always great to have you on, and I could talk to you for another 2 hours, I think, with just the amount of knowledge that you have.
In our current environment, there's a lot of people who I have a lot in common with. I do share a lot of ideas with, in a reaction to, I guess, what would be called globalism. But in the reaction to that, they have, I feel like, been really led into another extreme, into something that I don't think they would like either. So I would just encourage people, we really don't try to be too political on here, and we're not really into analyzing the news too much or trying to, help people keep up with our analysis of it. But, I would just say, be very wary right now, and I think if you do really want to keep abreast of events, I would say definitely follow Stephen's work. It can really help you unravel things that are going on in current times.
Yeah, I second that, and I think it's just like what you've described too. The right side of the pyramid, we have to be weary of that, and we've got to be. We've got to see where propaganda is coming from, because it's not all from the left-hand side. It's from the right-hand side too. And a lot of these groups, they act just like they say that others that they castigate act like.
Yeah.
In fact, that's one thing I've noticed, Stephen, and you've talked about this too, is that there's this weird psychology in some of these groups where they will talk about, like, Council of National Policy. Like, I'm sure that they don't like the Council on Foreign Relations. However, they act just like it.
Yeah.
Tactically wise.
Well, yeah. I mean, that was even the whole name of it, essentially, was meant to be a play on the Council on Foreign Relations, or the Council for National Policy. National policy.
Yeah.
So yes. But I mean, it's, it's kind of interesting, but yeah, that's just really a common tactic, really, of reactionaries. Effectively, you accuse your adversaries of your own degradations and so forth. And ironically, I mean, this was something that was enshrined in the protocols of the learned elders of Zion.
Yeah.
The concept of accusing your enemies of your own outrages, which in turn was fabricated by, or most likely was fabricated by, the Tsarist secret police. So, I kind of think, in a sense, that whole little bit putting into the protocols might have been a bit of a Freudian projection on the part of the Tsarist secret police in the first place.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, where can people find your book, Stephen, and also where can they find The Farm?
Well, you can find the book at Amazon, and also for the PDF version at our official website, or the official store for The Farm. That is thefarmpodcast.store. That's again all one word, thefarmpodcast.store. And then you can find us at thefarmpodcast.com, I believe. So anyway, yes, you can find us at the Farm Podcast or the Farm Store to get the book. And then also there's my blog, which is visaview.blogspot.com. I haven't been doing quite as much with the blog lately because I'm scrambling to try to finish up the Epstein book in time for the elections. But I'm definitely hoping getting into October, I'll be able to get back to doing some more current events stuff there. And obviously we're going to be doing a lot of election stuff on the farm when we get closer to the season. But some of these series and what have you I've been working on, especially the Wacko one, they're really going to pay off when we get close to the election. Trust me on that.
Oh, well.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice. Yeah, keep it going. You're really doing a good job with it. And I want to thank you for coming on and stay on the line for us, but we're going to close this section out, and we'll be back to close out this show on Conspirinormal. All right, well, let's finish this up, guys. That was a great show with Recluse. I'm always happy to have him on. What did you think about that, man? I think I ask you that every show. But...
Yeah, I think that was pretty cool. We touched on I think everything we wanted to, and then some. We've both been listening to the farm a lot. It's been really cool to see the man behind the spider reveal his identity, because when he was first blogging and stuff, he was just like, really, I don't even think, I think the first time we had him on the show, we were asking him, well, can we say your name? Were you just Recluse or what's up? So,
yeah. He was real mysterious at the very beginning, I don't think we did say his name. But if you do want to see what Recluse looks like, disappointing, guys, he's not a big spider. He doesn't look like Shelob from Lord of the Rings, but he is going to be speaking at the Strange Realities Conference, as we alluded to several times. And to get your tickets, guys, they are now $20, and we've got a great lineup of people that are going to be there, including Alan Greenfield and John Tinney and Soraya from Where Did the Road Go, Greg Bishop, Joshua Cutchin, Timothy Renner, Tim Banal, Kiki Dombrowski, Jenny Ashford. I'm sure I'm leaving people out.
It's like WrestleMania.
Just to name a few. So that's what we've got, guys. You really, this is kind of like a once in a lifetime opportunity. You don't really have anything else to do right now. So come join us at Strange Realities Conference. Get your tickets. That's linked up to strangerealitiesconference.com. So anything else that we want to add for this episode?
Well, what'd you think about it, Adam?
I thought that it was everything that I expected it to be. I think we covered a lot of good ground. I'm glad that we got in the talk about psychological warfare and fourth generation or fifth generation, depending on that definition seems to change, that term seems to change depending on who you talk to. That's just like the levels of different warfare. You can kind of look at that for yourself, but that's definitely something that I think that we're under right now. I mean, there's just so much that is going on right now, and so many people that are vying for your attention to try to get you as an American citizen to do what they want you to do. And
both
like
foreign and domestic.
Both foreign and domestic. And as we said before, be careful. Be careful about what you're seeing, what you're looking at. It's not all, it might affirm your confirmation bias, but if you dig a little bit deeper, it's usually not something that's in your best interest.
Yeah,
that's just the way that it is.
They have essentially brought the Psy War home.
Yeah,
and that's our current environment, and the different interests that might seek to gain from chaos, decentralization, all these things we're talking about. This is really really real, and I'm not as doomsday as a lot of people, But the parallels we have in what we were talking about today in the dissolution of the USSR is really striking. You know, that people at that level of a state could actively seek to dismantle the state to personally gain power.
Yeah.
I think we're seeing something similar go on. And, if you are trying to figure out these pyramids and relationships, don't neglect the whole other side of the pyramid. You don't have to be a globalist or internationalist. You still need to see where the information you're being fed is coming from.
Exactly. If it's coming from some one-sided source, that it's probably not that great. And
you probably don't want this alternative that the people who are feeding you information have in mind. You don't have to be like a fascist, or I don't even know whatever this political ideology is, just because you disagree with the establishment and globalism, internationalism, things like that. You don't have to. That doesn't mean you have to be the exact polar opposite.
Yeah, I agree. It's a crazy world, man. And things are not all black and white, and things are not all good and evil. A lot of people, they play in melodrama and they play in just like total dichotomy. It's usually much more complicated than that. And it goes back to what Alan Moore said about conspiracy, is that they want to believe that there's some big entity behind it, when the truth is it's just chaos. And you've got many different voices from many different areas making you think that what you're seeing is some eternal force between, but some eternal battle between good and evil. And it's not the case. It's usually one group of bullies fighting another group of bullies. That's usually what it is.
And it's literally a matter of life and death right now.
Yes, it is.
As far as the information war and what information you're choosing to believe can cost you your life as an American right now.
Yes, it is. All right. So, guys, if you're interested in helping us out, you can go to Patreon. It's as little as $1 to join up. We're going to have a lot of stuff on there. We need to get back to doing extra shows, because for the moment, on the day that we're recording this, we're putting up Strange Realities Conference. And we're going to be doing a live stream event pretty soon on that. I'm thinking probably about a month before the conference itself.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm looking at probably around like the 29th or 30th of August, something like that, to possibly do that. We'll talk about that more later. But stay tuned for that. We're going to live stream the footage from last year's conference. So just stay tuned to the Conspirinormal Facebook page, my Facebook page, whatever, and Twitter and Instagram. All right, I think that's it. We'll be back for we'll probably get a little more into the supernatural next week. And we'll be back on Conspirinormal.
If you would like to help the show, please consider becoming a Patreon at www.patreon.com/Conspirinormal, or leave a one-time donation at Conspirinormal.com. And please check out our YouTube channel, Conspirinormal Podcast.